me draw you in here as well on, of course, the vested interests that are at play once again here with this slanted reportage. Does it surprise you anymore? Firstly, secondly, looking at how things stand currently, do you believe it's unlikely that there will be any change in policy? And what is the economics of it all?
Clearly there is a slant, right? And it will be a slant by the Western media, which will be for the Western media. In US, it'll be a slant which will be aligned to the interest of the US people. The surprising part is that we have media in this country which is not aligned to the interest of Indian people. So that's a different story altogether. Therefore, NewsX as a channel is much favored because it speaks in the interest of the Indian people. Having said that, what is it that the West is misrepresenting? Let's take one example of energy imports from Russia, because that's what's being talked about. India is importing roughly, let's say, 650 million barrels of oil from Russia. And let's take that at face value. How much of uranium is being imported by the US? It's about 335 tons of enriched uranium being imported. So how do we compare uranium with oil? Because both are essentially energy imports. We're not using these for anything else, but largely for energy. 335 tons of enriched uranium is more than equal to 800 million barrels of oil. And what we are importing from Russia is much lesser. So US continues to import much more energy from Russia than what we are, and that's being completely glossed over. I'm not even talking about what the Europe is importing. I'm not even talking about what Turkey and Germany are importing. And anything that the US needs or the Europe needs, that is excluded from the targets of what needs to be or not needs to be purchased from Russia. So the African countries, India and so on, has to face the brunt of the whims and fancies of the West, and in this case of one single individual, because clearly it seems that the US is no more being run through a democratic process, but power has been concentrated with one person. That's the wish of the American people, and that's fine. But when they're pontifying India about buying of procuring energy from Russia, the same in much larger quantity is being done by the US. And it's been an old habit of picking up one or two things in the portfolio of trade between US and India and making that as an example. For quite some time, it was Harley Davidson. Harley Davidson motorcycles were not even a rounding of error in terms of imports from US to India. And it never became, even after reduction of the tariffs, there was no impact of Harley Davidson. They had to pack up their bags and leave and then come back only through joint ventures, because on their own they could not produce equipment and motorcycles which could win in this market. We have had the Japanese, the Koreans, and even the Chinese winning in the automobile market in India, but largely the US players have been wiped out. So there is a deeper thought that the Americans have to do, because automobiles is a significant portion of any economy. Typically, it's about 20% of any economy. And if they're not competitive in that sector, then that's where one conjures up things like tariffs. It just indicates that the US economy seems to have got weaker in the perspective of the US president. Because typically you bring up tariffs when your economy is not strong, which is why developing countries who are under centuries of colonial rule, their industry is completely wiped out. They needed tariffs in order to support their infantile industry, not a giant economy like the US. But if the perception is that the US economy has become weakened up, it is not as good as even the infantile industries in the developing countries, then perhaps that's why the government of US is going for such large measures of tariff. It can no longer compete with the rest of the world on an even footing. And the way the reality is being put and projected in the media, which is being pushed by the West, is completely different from reality. Because the reality is the US is procuring more energy from Russia than India is. The US industries is getting weak for whatever reason. And if they move into labor-intensive industries, that labor will not be human labor; it will be robotic labor, and therefore that will not lead to more jobs in US. And with all the inflation coming in, there will be a reduced purchasing power in US, which will then lead to all the things that Mitali was talking about. It will have its own repercussions, where it will be a vicious reduction of the global economy, as well as the US economy. And with more job loss in US, there will be lesser purchasing power. So it becomes a vicious cycle that they will fall into, triggered by the steps that are being taken now. And again, this is nothing new. This is well known. In the 1930s, that's how the Great Depression happened. And in fact, every 100 years, 1830, there was a depression that happened in US because of tariffs. 1930s, similar thing. 20, 25, similar thing. Every 100 years, US seems to be shooting itself in the foot by misinformed policies in terms of tariff, and it's going to have an impact all over the world, like it happened in 1930.